Okay, so we are recording this meeting. The purpose of the recording is just to have a kind of an archive. We've been posting those on the Thursday webinar webpage as well, so they're just YouTube videos. Feel free to share those links with other people too, if there's folks in your Lake District that you wish could have been involved in this. A lot of the challenges around Lake Districts for budgeting purposes and thinking about the Treasury role is that a lot of people come into Lake Districts with a background in lake associations. They were part of a lake association for a while, or they know about lake associations, and they try to bring that budget mentality into Lake Districts. But there's a really big difference between these two. When you're working with Lake Districts, you're working with public dollars. And so you're working generally with what we would call tax money, taxpayers' money, whether it comes in through special charges or through the tax levy, which we'll talk about later on. But there's a different set of sort of expectations and principles around working with government money. So just on this slide again, pointing out that what we're going to be talking about is really appropriate for special purpose units of local government. Some of the principles here would apply if you were a school district or a sanitary district. Some of them are kind of carved out specifically out of Chapter 33, which is the piece of state statute that gives power to lake districts and should really guide how they operate. And we'll try to include some references to Chapter 33 as we go through some of these slides. As opposed to say a nonprofit or even a for-profit, there's really this four-step process highlighted in yellow that we'll try and bring up as we go through these slides, but it's sort of stages in the process. You can hear this happening sort of at the state of Wisconsin level right now, where the governor and the state agencies have made budget requests to the legislature. So those are appropriations, they're asking for money. And right now the legislature is going through a process of modifying those appropriation requests and creating what might be more like the actual state of Wisconsin budget. What we're going to be doing in Lake Districts is just a very micro version of that. And then there's sort of the last two ones, sort of the nitty gritty of authorizing the actual spending. So when it comes time to actually cut a check or pay a bill, and then finally making sure that you're doing an annual process, a cycle of accounting for how the money was spent and reporting that back out. A core piece of this is what we would call the printed budget itself. And when I say annual budget document, what we're really referring to is almost like a version of a one-page version of your entire budget. Lake districts, when they were conceived of, were really meant to be fairly simple affairs. These weren't meant to be highly complicated with lots and lots of different budget lines. So your budget, the state of Wisconsin proposed budget might be 560 pages long. The Lake District budget really ought to be able to be compressed into a one-page document. And statute requires a couple of these things. It has to show the actual revenue and expenditures for the entire previous year. And then think about the current year that you're in. You want to talk about what the actual revenues and expenditures were for at least the first 6 months of that year. And then talk about, what is the forecast for closing out the rest of the year. You also have to show if you have indebtedness, you want to calculate that and demonstrate it or show it on the budget document, and then talk about other alternative sources of money coming in the coming year. The sort of meaty part of this is proposed expenses for different categories and showing potentially a reserve account for the ensuing year. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Anticipated unexpended or unappropriated account balances and surpluses for informational purposes. So again, if you have things like a capital reserve, that needs to be documented in the budget as well. Where it says on this slide, page 74 and 75, that still applies. That's still making a reference back to our guide, People of the Lakes, which is the manual that we distribute out and share with people freely to kind of walk you through this process of running the Lake District. And Appendix F is a model or a template version of that one-page budget. My predecessors put together this sort of template budget that you could look at and mimic very much in your own budgeting process, but it's meant to comply with all the bullet points we just went through. I don't know if maybe if Mike has the time, he can find a link to our People of the Lakes Appendix F and just throw that in the chat if people wanted to look at that. I find it hard to toggle out of PowerPoint and into other documents, but if you wanted to, I could do that as well.
Already done.
Okay, thank you, Mike. This is just a budgeting concept I want to get out of the way before we get too deep into the weeds. There's this idea that this is actually where Lake Association and Lake District budgets sometimes come sort of head to head on this. And it's the idea of saving up money for big projects. There is a way through statute that you can start banking money and save it for big capital expenses. There's some examples of what you might do here. And if you're in a lake association, you almost don't have a choice but to do that. And so a lot of people with lake association background, they're like, well, we want to buy a harvester. So here's our goal. We got to raise $200,000. Let's get to work, year after year, chipping away, trying to raise that money, because then they can finally go out and purchase that equipment. Government, whether it's, again, a lake district or a school district or a county board, they have available to them the ability to borrow money at fairly low interest rates and then pay for things that are capital projects over future years. And the reason why in public finance we recommend doing that is that there's a better match between the people who benefit from the expenditure and the people who are actually paying into the expenditure. And so a simple example built around the aquatic plant harvester would be, you might save up for 10 years to buy that harvester, and you're taxing somebody. Let's say where Mike Engelson lives on the lakes and he's been paying taxes for 10 years to build up that reserve account to buy a new harvester. And then Mike finally sells his house and moves off the lake. And that's the same year that the Lake District buys the new harvester and puts it into use. And then they drop their taxes. They're like, oh, we don't have to save up money every year for this piece of equipment. Well, Mike paid in for that thing, but he never really gets to see the benefit of it being used on the lake. And the alternative reality, the Lake District buys it right away and then pays off the debt over 10 years. If Mike is on the lake for 5 of those years and then sells his place and moves somewhere else, he benefited from those first 5 years, and then the next person benefits for the next 5 years. The Board of Commissioners of Public Land is sort of this, it's a state agency that's actually set up to make modest loans to entities like lake districts and school districts and towns and villages. And in the environment that we're in, the economic environment that we're in, borrowing that money is relatively inexpensive. And so there's not many arguments against borrowing money. But it's a really hard mentality for people to grasp when they're thinking about their lake district budget. So I wanted to get this addressed up front and sort of point out that while you can create non-lapsable funds and build up bank accounts, we don't generally advise you do that. We generally advise that you borrow money and pay it back. Another problem that's created when a lake district creates a large non-lapsable fund is that they may change their mind at some point, or the need for that capital equipment goes away. And then they're sort of stuck with maybe it's an enviable problem, but they have a pile of money and they're not sure what to do with it. And most people would say that's a formula for disaster. That's a way to get into trouble. What you really should do then is figure out a way to spend that down by reducing your levy for a number of years. But that puts the board and the members, the property owners and the ratepayers into a pickle that they really shouldn't get themselves into. So we also don't recommend that you try to build these reserve accounts. Again, if you're a nonprofit lake association, you wanted to have those big reserve accounts because you didn't know if that big fundraiser was going to happen next year. Now we have a pretty good example of there could be a pandemic, and so we can't get together and do the big fishing tournament we thought we were going to do, and that's going to wipe out our budget. Welcome to the world of lake districts where you get to raise taxes. So you get to, I pay my property taxes every year, regardless of whether or not my city of Stevens Point had a successful fundraising event. So try to be thinking like a town, like a county. Don't build up big reserve accounts. We just don't see the value in it. There's a statutory requirement that when you're putting together that budget, if there's something that's going to cost more than $10,000, it has to be itemized out. So things that are less than $10,000, you can sort of lump them all together and just have a simple blanket statement of what those items are. But once a bill is going to be expected to be over $10,000, you have to list it out so that people know where the big ticket items are within your budget. And you can't, take a big project like, say, your aquatic plant treatment and say, well, let's talk about, phase 1A, phase 1B, phase 2. Let's break it up and make it, then we don't have to itemize it. We'll just say lake health, and lake health will include these aquatic plant treatments. If the aquatic plant treatments add up to more than $10,000, please just show that on the budget. Another big difference between, say, a local government, or I'm sorry, between a town as well as a lake association is the process at which a budget is adopted in a lake district. It's very, very unique. It happens really exclusively through the annual meeting. And as you can imagine, last year that created quite a lot of pickles because the annual meeting has to be an in-person, you must be there to vote, affair. And it can be a critical step for any lake district. The reason why it has to be an in-person, you have to be there to participate type of affair is that nobody really knows exactly what the annual budget is until the final vote at that annual meeting on the budget, because amendments can be made. People can make amendment recommendations from the floor. Those changes can get a second. If the majority of people at the meeting vote to make an edit to the budget, then that edit becomes part of the draft budget that people then vote on. So if you tried to vote absentee or early on the budget, you wouldn't know exactly what budget you're voting on. It would be kind of a senseless exercise. You also at the annual meeting need to get fairly specific about how you're going to raise that money. And we'll talk about these in more detail. But there are these options between just a straight up tax levy that's based on property value, special charges, which are not based on property value per se, and special assessments, which are very complex. And we're not going to get into too much detail on those, but we'll mention them in a second. So this is sort of satisfying the appropriation and allocation phases of developing a government budget.
Eric, before you move on, just a couple of quick questions that are sort of
Sure.
related to those slides. So if I don't get all of your questions inserted immediately, we'll get to those at the end. But Jean was wondering, is there guidance on the dollar amount of when to capitalize, when to go to the a non-lapsable fund, I think is what he was asking.
Well, I think, you can make the distinction between a capital thing that's going to be expected to last multiple years. Like you shouldn't be buying a new harvester every year. And so that really is what kind of defines a capital project. And believe it or not, like buying an office chair, if that office chair is going to last 10 years, you should think about like, well, that's a capital project. The dollar amount thing might have to do more with the fact that there's levy limits, which we'll talk about in a second. So if you had a big enough capital project that you said, well, we don't have a choice but to save up for 3 years because buying it in year 1 is impossible because it would exceed our levy limit. That is kind of driven by how big your lake district is and how expensive the project is that you're taking on.
And then the other question was, are these budgets always on an annual basis, or are they sometimes over a fiscal year?
We'll talk about that in a second, but
Okay.
We generally would expect people to try to calendar their budget based on the calendar year. So starting January 1, you don't have to, and I think we have a slide that kind of talks about that. But it seems to, if you really want to comport with the county budget and the town budget and their revenue process, you're probably going to operate best off on the January 1 cycle. The weird part about that is that the state of Wisconsin budgets on an off cycle. So July 1 is the beginning of the state budget cycle, but that shouldn't have too much of an impact on your lake district budgets. Mostly you want to synchronize with the issuing of tax bills by your local jurisdictions that are going to help you out with that.
See, I should have looked at your slides ahead of time so that I would know when you had answers coming up.
That's all right.
Carry on.
Okay. So we talked about this. Key thing I want to point out here, we mentioned this in a couple of these sessions, whenever we're talking to lake districts, this is a kind of a killer for some people. They've probably been operating, not paying attention to this fully, but there is a requirement that the notice of the annual meeting does have to be physically mailed to all property owners within the district. You cannot get around that. You can't email it out. You can't use a public notice to get around that. It must be physically mailed to the property owners. There's the piece of the statute that comes from also says mail it to electors. And some people are like, well, electors, who are those? Well, electors are people who live in the district, but they may not own property in the district. So they're maybe transient folks. You might want to think of them as or they could be long-term renters. So they don't have to be transient, but they're people who this is their normal voting location, but you don't have to own property in the United States of America in order to participate in democracy. And so you can't really get around this, that if you live in the Lake District, you get to vote in the Lake District. Now, the challenge is that anybody running a Lake District doesn't know who those people are necessarily. There could be, in the case of like, let's think about Lauderdale Lake District in southeastern Wisconsin, there may be dozens of people who are renters who don't own the property that they reside in, but there's no grand list of who they are. And so the notice in the paper is to kind of cover the fact that you probably don't know who those electors who are not property owners are. And that notice again has to include the budget requirements that we mentioned earlier. So the one-page version of the budget gets included with that notice. And the notice will also include the agenda. I think we have a slide here. So the basics of what goes on that notice: time, date, and place of the meeting, the agenda in fairly specific detail, but also that proposed budget. So it can't, I see some people try to get away with like, well, we're going to raise $40,000 and we're going to spend $40,000. That's our budget. No, there's statutory requirements on what your budget has to look like. It should look like the document in Appendix F, which was linked by Mike into the chat. And so please try to do what you can to get a version of your budget that fits in with that.
Question of whether the meeting notice can be sent out 2 months before the meeting.
Yeah, the only tricky part about that is that statutory definition of what you're supposed to show is supposed to show like 6 months of the current year and then what you're forecasted to spend for the next year. I think, you know, if there was a place where I'd say you might have a little sort of no one's going to care if you could only show the first 4 months and then you're forecasting the next 8 months. But it's supposed to be the 6 months. So the answer is yes. That also means though that your whole board and all of your budget planning starts pretty early in an annual cycle, you know, if you're trying to do that. But if let's say your meeting is at the end of September, or let's say early September, you still then you probably wouldn't have too much trouble meeting that first 6 months of reporting. And it means that your board is developing that document right about this time of year. It at least has to go out 14 days before the meeting. That's sort of a critical piece. So you can't do it at the last minute. So someone asked again about the fiscal year, usually based on a calendar year, because it kind of comports and synchronizes. If you're going to switch it to something else, you have to do that through an annual meeting. So it can't be like the treasurer woke up one day and decided to change it, and so now it's different. Instead, it has to be something where everybody at the annual meeting agreed that it's a good idea to change the fiscal year. It probably doesn't happen that often because I gotta imagine it's a bit of a headache changing the calendar, changing your fiscal year. So this is again a tricky slide here, but this has to do with when you're a local unit of government, if you close out the year and a bunch of projects say didn't happen, maybe you didn't spend a bunch of money that you thought you were going to spend, you really should then show that that's getting brought into the next year to be spent down. And if you kind of thought you were going to have the same level of revenue, say $40,000 year 1, 2, and 3, but you didn't spend it in year 2, then your year 3 revenue should probably go down to show the fact that you didn't spend it in year 2, and so instead it's going to be spent on the same projects in year 3. We really again advise against saying like, oh look, we had all this extra money and let's put it in the rainy day fund and maybe we'll spend it someday. Those rainy day funds are nothing but a future source of problems. There's also sort of a way you can budget for an expense that you think is going to be expensive and budget it over multiple years And that involves, saying that maybe the aquatic, let's say it's the aquatic plant survey, and you kind of know or sense it's going to cost $12,000. You could budget, well, but we think we're going to spend $4,000 in the first year, even though we kind of know it may not get spent. And then at the end of the year, you're like, oh, look, the $4,000 didn't get spent. We think next year it's going to cost $8,000. So you budget $8,000 for the second year. And at the end of the year, you're like, oh, look, we didn't spend the $8,000. Now we know it's going to cost $12,000. Let's put that back in the budget at $12,000. And in a way, you were sort of building up a mini account to expend on something that maybe doesn't have to happen on an annual basis. Like an aquatic plant survey, you may not have to do that every year. And the only reason why a lot of people get into those sort of exercises is that really Lake District budgets are so small that little variations in how much you're raising, like $4,000, can actually be a significant chunk of your budget. For most counties and school districts, $4,000 to $40,000 are just sort of like little percentage blips in the overall budget. But a lot of Lake District budgets are super small, and so those expenses they just don't want to have such a wild fluctuation in the budget years from year to year. So we talked briefly about these other sources. I do want to stress again that you have the mill levy and special charges. We have some numbers that I'll show you that sort of reflect how people in Lake Districts are actually using those. The mill levy is just like your school district and your county and town. It shows up, it reflects your property value. So the more valuable your property is, the more you're chipping in towards these affairs. Special charges can vary off of that. Instead of based on value, that could be sort of like a flat $50 fee per property owner on the tax bills. And a lot of people, because they come into Lake Districts out of Lake Associations, they see that as more palatable. They think, we used to be paying $50 memberships, so let's just continue doing $50 special charges going forward. You can do it. The statutes pretty much let you do it. Some people in state government say, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Like the Department of Revenue prefers to see all of your general taxes, all your general, government expenses being paid for through the mill levy. But again, Lake Districts are kind of so small that no one seems to be making much of a hassle out of it. Please pay attention to the words you use when you talk about special charges and special assessments, because special assessments are very different than special charges. Your special charges are usually just these annual fees that you can levy on people. You can force them to pay them, but that's sort of what they are. The special assessment is usually attached to a major project, a capital project, like building a dam or building a wastewater treatment plant. And those special assessments then they're going to constitute a lien on every piece of real estate within the special assessment area. And to go through the legal steps necessary for that to be enforceable, usually you bring on some attorneys, public finance attorneys, who are going to help make sure every T is crossed and every I is dotted. It really only applies to those big special projects. Don't use the word special assessment when you really mean special charges. So get in the habit of talking about special charges rather than assessments. Lake Districts are also eligible to receive grants. Someone had a question about grants earlier. You can, obviously, a lot of Lake Districts apply for and get Wisconsin DNR grants. People can make donations to Lake Districts. They're automatically tax exempt, and donations to Lake Districts are write off. You can write them off of your individual taxes if you wanted to make those donations. Just like if you made a big donation to the school district because you wanted to build a new football stadium, that is also tax deductible. So keep that in mind. Your door should be open if people want to make contributions of those kind. Just some numbers here. These are from a couple of years ago. I kind of ran through, there's no good source for data that summarizes all the Lake Districts in Wisconsin. Department of Revenue just doesn't spend a lot of time summarizing what goes on with Lake Districts. But every local unit of government has to report to Department of Revenue every dollar and cent that they took in, even if it was then redistributed back to a Lake District. So if you go through some Department of Revenue reports, you can find how much revenue was collected by every lake district in the state, put it into a table and summarize it up. And it's broken out by, was it collected as special charges or was it collected as on the mill levy? So in this 1 year, the total for all lake districts in the state was just under $10 million. And you can see the breakout there, roughly 60 to 40%, if you want to call it that, between the mill levy and special charges. And you can see the average amount that a lake district collected using those approaches, and they're remarkably similar. So this tells you again what the average district is doing that raises revenue. Their budget is somewhere in the realm of just under $50,000. There certainly are exceptions to that. And I pointed out in 2018, the Tri-Lakes district here nearby, Stevens Point and Adams County, collected for that year over $500,000. So that's a pretty significant amount of money. There's a number of districts though that also have no revenue. Some of them just go year after year without needing to collect revenue. Some of them, to explain how this happens, some of them are actually run by village boards. There's some small communities in Wisconsin like Iola and Wild Rose, where the village board really is the Lake District board. And so it's not too hard for them to always rejuvenate their Lake District if they needed to, in order to schedule an annual meeting and charge revenue. But if they're not raising money, then they just sort of, they have a $0 budget. So again, I mentioned the Department of Revenue likes to see you pay for general activities out of the mill levy. It's sort of the same format of government that we use for your county and all these other local units of government. And so why not put them into the mill levy? And we would encourage you to do that, but we also understand why lake districts sometimes want to focus instead on special charges. Lake districts have always had a built-in levy limit. So a lot of times when people are forming lake districts, there's a lot of sort of wild-eyed, crazy conspiracies about how much money the lake district is going to charge everybody and how, you know, they're going to start building palaces of the lake district. It's pretty hard to do that because you have a built-in levy limit of $2.50 per $1,000 of equalized value. I did take a look once because the Department of Revenue puts out some other reports and was able to find that no lake district is really exceeding that. Most lake districts are well under that. So everybody is sort of, the grand fears of being taxed to death by a lake district are a little bit overblown. Special charges, again, in sort of public finance theory, what they should be used is for identifying people who maybe get a special benefit from the lake district and therefore ought to be asked to kick in for that special benefit. So a really good example might be a big lake with a big lake district, and there's one bay that's very problematic as far as aquatic plants. And so the lake district is running their harvesting operation, and they find that in order to keep just navigation channels open in that bay, they have to go in there on a weekly basis or even more frequently at sometimes in the summer. And so because they're basically providing navigation channels to the property owners in that bay, maybe it makes sense to charge this property owners in that bay an extra amount to pay for that extra expense, right? So it's not, someone is getting something kind of special or above and beyond by the lake district, so why not ask them to chip in for it? In reality, it gets kind of complicated, right? You still have to talk about that at the annual meeting and make sure everyone buys into that idea. Again, what I've seen is that a lot more lake districts just have sort of a flat fee that they charge everybody just to kind of keep the lake district operating. Special charges have a similar but separate limit on them, a cap. And here the cap is really on the total amount of money that you can raise by applying special charges to people. And it's basically the equivalent of 2.5 mils if you were to apply that across all the property that could be taxed within the district. And sort of the reason why there's that distinction is that tax exempt property can receive a special charge bill from the lake district that can be legitimate and can be collected. Tax exempt property does not get any really bill on the mill levy because they'd say we're tax exempt. Or if you go into the Department of Revenue or the county's system of mapping parcels and you click on the church parcel, it probably says the value here is 0. So you can't really calculate what their tax would be on the mill levy, but you can send them a $50 invoice that says, you owe the special charges for the Lake District. And in a good way to understand this is stormwater fees that are used in many municipalities in Wisconsin. The schools in Stevens Point, the churches and the hospitals in Stevens Point, they all have to pay in to the stormwater fees. And it makes sense because they have parking lots, they have buildings, they're using the stormwater system. So let's have them chip in for the stormwater system. So special charges can be levied against tax exempt properties. The one exception there is state and federal government. You'd have a hard time sending them a bill. When it comes to the special charges, you kind of have to decide at the annual meeting, either the electors and property owners are going to say, here's exactly how it's going to be charged against people, or they could say, you know what, we defer to the commissioners. We want them to figure it out how they're going to divide out the special charges. But it has to be decided one way or the other, right? You have to figure that out. So we kind of mentioned this example. Maybe you say, on our whole budget, we have a bunch of the budget is going to be covered. Just it's the general operations of the Lake District. We're going to use the mill levy. But when it comes to the harvesting of plants or chemical treatment of plants, we're going to be more targeted in terms of who pays for what. So if you're in Milfoil Bay, you're going to chip in a little bit more because we're going to spend a lot of our time and money in Milfoil Bay. It has to kind of comply with some broader legal standards around how governments make these charges. And really those have to do with not being arbitrary or capricious and having some sort of rationale behind them and a defensible logic behind how you're charging it. So if you looked at Milfoil Bay and you said, oh, look, Bill Gates owns a $3 million house in Milfoil Bay, let's just stick him with the charge. And everybody else in Milfoil Bay gets to kind of wave and say, hi, Bill. That would not be fair. Everybody in the Bay ought to be treated fairly equally instead of assigning it to one person. So I mentioned before, special charges or special assessments, again, only use the term special assessment when you're really talking about special assessment, and they're a very rare case really with lake districts. And typically they do involve debt. Because they do involve things like building a dam or building a wastewater treatment plant. And that's the kind of thing that really the public debt market is used to seeing. They're like, okay, you're gonna spend $15 million on a plant here. That's a hefty expense. But we're gonna work with you to get lenders across the country to potentially borrow you money to pay for that. That's what I mean by municipal bond rates too. You'll find that right now, I think the Board of Commissioners of Public Land, those easier loans, that's not the same as bonding. That's basically just going to a unique lending facility for local governments. Their rates are probably a little bit more than what you would get on the bond market. But at the same time, if you did try to do a debt issuance through the bond market, you're going to be required to produce a lot of paperwork ahead of time, a lot of audited books, and a lot of documentation that verifies that you're a local government in good standing. The Board of Commissioners of Public Lands actually have a really easy grant process. So you might pay a slightly higher interest rate, but you're going to have a much easier time getting the money that you need. And this is where I mentioned again, it's a lien against properties. And if there's municipally owned properties, they can also be subject to special assessments. So that was all basically about raising the money. There's obviously the next step, which is sort of spending the money. This is where, if a lot of you are treasurers, your role is kind of on a month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter basis, spent keeping track of bills, paying bills, getting authorization from the board to pay bills. Sometimes the board might say, if you've got minor expenses, we authorize you to just in between meetings pay those bills. But generally you'd want, if it's major expenses, you'd want the board to know that those bills have been brought to the board, that they've been approved for payment, and then that payment is going out the door. could only say that there still can be a lot of variation from lake district to lake district in terms of how they do this. But you do need to keep records of what you're doing. And those records, believe it or not, are public records. So that's kind of why there's the Department of Justice reference here. This is another big distinction between a lake association and a lake district, is that all of your finances are really public knowledge. And I would encourage you to spend some time trying to make sure that the public and the ratepayers in your districts can obtain this information. Maybe they don't need to see all the invoices and all the bills per se, but it shouldn't be a mystery how much money the Lake District has and how much money the Lake District is budgeting to spend. I'm surprised, even though there's lots of lake districts that have web pages, and a lot of lake districts that have web pages that have, here's our documents area, or here's our agendas. Their agenda for the annual meeting, the PDF or the electronic version doesn't include the budget. It probably should, it could. I'd encourage you to put it out there. The way you get ratepayers or taxpayers, property owners to be concerned about things is to make it seem like there's some shroud of secrecy around what the Lake District is up to. So the more transparent you can be, the more you're going to be sort of displaying what we in Wisconsin consider to be clean and open government. That's going to be all the better. It'll keep you out of a lot of trouble. So try to make sure that you're showing what's happening with your budget as publicly as possible. You don't need to publish a scanned version of every check that comes through. That would be problematic for another reason. But for each quarterly meeting, maybe you report out here's where the treasury's at quarterly meeting. The treasury gave a report on how much total spending we had in the last quarter and how much we anticipate in the future. If you do that on a regular basis, it makes it a lot easier to develop your annual budget when it comes time to put that together. A couple of kind of tips here, kind of seems basic, but make sure you have a bank account that you're running this through. We had an article in Lake Tides. You should have sort of like an operating bank account, but you can also set up a bank account with the state of Wisconsin. There's a very unique little part of Wisconsin that's similar to the Board of Commissioners of Public Land, but different. But it offers essentially a banking service that's only available to local units of government. So school districts and lake districts are eligible to use that banking service. And the reason why you might want to do that is that they do offer some interest rate on the money that you have sitting in there. So right now, most checking accounts have almost a 0% interest. The state of Wisconsin has giant pools of money that they are investing on a regular basis, and they oftentimes can get a better rate of return. There is no requirement on how many signatories. There's obviously a reason why you might want to have two, just to make sure that your treasurer doesn't get sort of creative with their use of the money. There's only a handful of examples of treasurers in Wisconsin who were found to be actually misappropriating money and essentially skimming or cheating lake districts. It does not happen very often. Bidding is another piece of sort of how money could get misappropriated or misspent. Wisconsin has, again, a tradition of open and clean government. And part of that is that we don't want to see people who are part of, whether it's a county board or a lake district board, we don't want to see them rewarding themselves or rewarding their family or their friends because they sit on a position of authority with like a lake district. And so bids are meant to kick the door open and to make sure that lots of possible competitors are able to put forward bids for projects that are being done under the public's eye. So again, that's very different than a lake association where you don't really have to do bids at all. But because now you're spending taxpayer dollars, you have to make sure that you're complying with some bidding rules and regulations. And I mentioned at the very beginning of the meeting, there's still a fairly low threshold here, $2,500. It's been stuck at that dollar amount for decades. But if you're going to do a contract for performance of work over $2,500 or buy material worth more than $2,500, you ought to be issuing a bid for that, or you ought to be putting it out to bid. I'm not an expert in bidding process. My guidance here, that last bullet point, is to find out how your neighbors are doing this. And by your neighbors, I mean one or two town governments around you are probably also, because they're local units of government, they're also complying with bidding expectations. I don't think they have to adhere to the $2,500, but maybe it's $5,000 or $10,000. And if they're scale, they're probably doing bidding more frequently, and they can give you some tips and guidance as to how to issue bids and how to review bids and go through that process.
And Eric, I'll just quickly mention that I think you alluded to it earlier. There was a bill last session that would have increased that amount from 2,500 to 10,000. Unfortunately, it had some amendments added to it that had absolutely nothing to do with lake districts, and it was voted down as a result. And then the pandemic hit, and there wasn't any ability to resuscitate it. I'm guessing it probably will come back, or we'll be advocating for it at least to come back this session. So just so everyone knows.
There's some tricky language in chapter 33, this idea of performance of work. Purchase of materials is fairly straightforward. If you were buying, if you were doing a really large stormwater infiltration basin, or a big rain garden, and somebody said, to make this really big rain garden work, you're gonna need 50 cubic yards of compost, and that's probably gonna cost you more than $2,500. That's buying materials. It's fairly straightforward. Then we're going to put the compost, the 50 whatever yards of compost out to bid. Performance of work is a language that's almost unique to chapter 33, and it's a little tricky, but we make a distinction between work, sort of labor, versus professional services, or things that are more sort of specialized and one-off. And so going in and doing aquatic plant treatments, applying chemicals, for example, on a lake in strict conformance with a permit that the Lake District and the DNR have agreed to and hold on to, that's conceived of as a sort of work and ought to be put out to bid. If it's just following the permit, going out and applying the chemicals according to the permit, that should be put out to bid. And contrast that to hiring someone to actually create an aquatic plant management plan. That might be more specialized knowledge, and that's really a professional service, and that doesn't necessarily need to be put out to bid. You still, again, want to be thinking competitively, or thinking that you're spending taxpayer dollars, so let's not waste it. You could put those things out to bid, but you have to put them out to bid if it's this work that would be worth more than $2,500. A couple more slides about this. Again, just the basis of this is that, again, clean government. We want to get the best prices possible. And so we have just a way to try to minimize or prevent fraud and things like that. And so we mentioned, if it's really under $2,500, you do not have to put it out to bid. Again, if the work is really about professional judgments or educated discretion, then that isn't work per se. Or if it's highly unique and potentially patented work, you wouldn't have to bid that out either. But again, things like carrying out the aquatic plant treatment using chemicals, that would be something that you probably would have to put out to bid. And I keep using that example because there's actually a state Supreme Court case in Wisconsin that clarified this for us and said, this is the type of activity that does actually have to go out to bid.
I have a question.
Sure. It's directly related.
Yeah. Before I came, the DNR, it was Ontario did consulting services, and the DNR apparently reached a grant agreement with them to do $49,000 worth of consulting to look at the invasive species. Now, Ontario comes back and says, well, we don't have to provide you any information as far as when the work was done or any hours or anything, because we agreed with the DNR on a grant, and therefore they just say grant item number 1 to do a survey, but they won't tell us when they did the survey. They refuse to tell us when the hours or anything. Do we have any repercussion to say, wait a minute, you got to tell us when the work was done and how many hours were spent or whatever? What how do other districts handle that? Because I've got a couple invoices, they look like they're doing the same thing, but they won't even tell us the date that they did it. They just say, well, I don't have to tell you that because it was under a grant.
Sure. So what we've been talking about today is really the chapter 33 requirements for running the Lake District. And what you're talking about gets a little bit beyond that. And I would point out that the DNR wants to be a good steward of those grant dollars as well. So in the last 2 years, the DNR went through a major revision of the grant process and the rules for the grants. And a big part of that was cost containment ideas that they included now that sort of try to limit the possibility that a partner like a lake association or a lake district is not getting what they paid for or is paying more than they should for a certain thing. I would say in your case or any case like it, you ought to be connecting directly with your grant contacts with the DNR to talk about what's going on. It's not necessarily my purview. It's the DNR's grant rules that you're going to want to invoke. And they also want to know how external partners or service providers are interacting with lake associations and lake districts. So it's a fair question, but I think you'd be best served going back to your DNR contacts and explaining maybe what your concerns are and trying to find out from them what the guidance is. Because in a sense, you're spending not only your lake district money, but you're spending state money, and they kind of want to know what's going on as well. So thanks for that question. I've only got a few more slides, I think, and then we'll get into more of a free-for-all as far as Q&A goes.
Yep,
So again, the treasurer ought to be bringing sort of quarterly, at least if you're meeting quarterly, they should be bringing some sort of budget report talking about sort of what's been spent or what are the current bills that need to be paid, where are we at in terms of the balances in different accounts. That should be happening on a really regular basis. If you're not doing that, then talk to us later because you're probably off into adventure land. This is sort of some of the nuts and bolts. It's almost like why you have to have quarterly meetings at least is so that you can review the bills and make sure that the money is being taken care of. Some lake districts are so active that they meet on a monthly basis. That's totally understandable. Some are even so active that they choose to meet on a 2-week basis in order to process the bills and keep track of the accounts. And you can do that. Quarterly is the minimum that you need to be meeting. You can meet as frequently as you need to beyond that. There's also a requirement in chapter 3 that an audit be done, but there's not much of a requirement beyond that, which is to say there's not a thorough definition of what constitutes an audit for the purposes of lake districts in chapter 33. It's just a requirement that it be presented at the annual meeting and that it be an audit. So that means you can have maybe just some people look at the books and make sure that everything appears as though it's on the up and up. It doesn't have to be a full-blown Deloitte and Touche, $10,000 public audit, because remember what we said before earlier, that a lot of lake districts have budgets that are around $40,000. It doesn't make sense to budget $10,000 to spend on an audit of a $40,000 budget. That's, in my understanding, that's kind of why there's not a thorough definition of what an audit is, because the statute is meant to apply to every lake district, including those that have, say, a $3,000 budget, as well as like the Tri-Lakes district with a budget over $500,000. They all are subject to these same rules. If you have a really large and complicated budget, it might make sense to interact with a public accounting firm on occasion. You don't have to do a full audit, but there's different levels of auditing that you can engage in. So you might ask for a public accountant to do a review and maybe to identify places where the way you're handling money could open you up to problems or misappropriation. That can be healthy to do on an occasional basis. You don't have to do it all the time, but think about that. But whatever that audit is, if it was a committee of 2 that reviewed the spending and verified that the treasurer wasn't writing double checks for everything and remunerating themselves, then that gets kind of shared and reported at the annual meeting. A couple of points to drive home. your automatic Lake District is automatically tax exempt. You don't have to go through the hoops and jumping of a 501c3 and trying to demonstrate that you're for a public cause. Instead, you are a special purpose unit of local government. There are examples of these throughout the country. Wisconsin is actually only has a few different types of special purpose units of local government. There's in Minnesota, for example, they have what are called mosquito control districts. And a mosquito control district is a special purpose unit of local government. I think you can guess why they exist, but they also collect revenue and spend it using public dollars, and they're automatically tax exempt as well. So you can get a standing certificate from the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. If you looked up that term, Wisconsin DOR S-211 on a Google search, it'll pop up. The DOA is also the Department of Administration is kind of part of how the state of Wisconsin keeps track of all these different special purpose units of local government. And they'd like to see that they all have a federal employee identification number, whether they have employees or not. It's just sort of like a social security number for organizations. And for a long time, they didn't require those, and now they're trying to ask for them. So if you haven't gone through the process of getting a fine number, you can talk to us later. You can send me an email and I'll give you some documentation to help you out with that. I do want to point out that we have a long tradition of getting together every spring. It was been interrupted for the last 2 springs, but we're already planning ahead to 2022. We will be getting together back in Stevens Point. A lot of positive indicators around this pandemic that we're moving in the right direction, and it's not going to be an issue for us to gather again in April of 2022. Try to save these dates. We try to schedule a range of different Lake District Commissioner workshops that are meant to be more interactive and more social than what this webinar platform permits. So those will take place on April 6th. It's an amazing event. No matter what, you can learn a lot about lakes. You can meet up with people from the DNR. You can interact with people not only from Ontario, but from a number of different consulting firms. If you wanted to find out if there's other consultants who would help you out with lake projects, this is a place to meet them one-on-one. And you can include this in your budget. So this is kind of why I mention it now. It's a legitimate thing. I'll tell you that the town that you live in or the city or village that you live in, they budget to go to the Wisconsin Towns Association or the League of Municipalities. The counties have a countywide association. It's about professional development for people who are in the commissioner roles. And so it's a legitimate thing to include in your budget. And I'll tell you now, you should also get together your tax exempt information, because when you get into the hotel, you can actually show them that you're a part of a lake district, and therefore you can't pay a sales tax, you're tax exempt. So roughly ballpark $600 a person, dealing with just the cost of hotels if you wanted to do 2 nights, as well as the registration, which usually includes meals. So that's my last plug. So now we get into the free-for-all Q&A. I can stick around for a while, so if you have to cut out, if you're like, oh, I'm overwhelmed, by all means, you do what you need to do. But Mike and I can stick around and take some Q&A, and I see Judy is still here. Judy might have some comments based on how I did. Hopefully I didn't get anything too terribly wrong. She's giving me a thumbs up. That's a good sign. So how are we doing? Do we have questions, Mike, that we want to?
There was a question early on, and if people you can put your questions in the chat. Probably if you'd like to talk, the easiest way to acknowledge you, if you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a button for reactions, and you can actually raise your hand. Just choose that. And I see Larry has raised his hand, so we'll get to you in just a second, Larry. The question from early on was, we have an approved DNR grant. Can I budget to receive funds from the grant, or do I have to assume the district will not be reimbursed in the coming year?
It's a hard question to ask, because there's actually differences across the different grant categories. Some of the grant categories it's explicitly in there that they're going to front you a good percentage of the grant. And some grant categories, they say, no, we're going to hold off and we're only going to reimburse you as expenses go. So it really does vary a lot. And as I mentioned before, the person really to direct that question to is your it's your grant specialist with the DNR. The person, it's not necessarily your biologist, but now there's sort of a cadre of people in the DNR that handle the financial questions about these grants to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So I would go back to them and say, when do you think we should be budgeting for these different sources of revenue? And they'll usually be pretty good about giving you an answer about what to expect.
Larry, why don't you go ahead and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I made a quick statement earlier in the chat box. This is part one here, is that we noticed in our grant agreements that they now require, I don't know now, but we finally noticed it, that we're supposed to track all grant dollars in separate accounts. It doesn't have to be a separate bank account, but it has to be like in our ledger, we have special line items for aquatic plant control, and we track all of their dollars that way. So that's really forced extra burden on us tracking dollars. And I was just curious if anybody else has had experience with that or noticed that. So that's one question. And the second question is on payroll. I asked at another meeting, do you guys have a list of folks that provide payroll services to lake districts? Because we want to start paying our clean boat, clean water inspectors. And I noticed that, like you guys are hooked up to do the lakekit.net thing. And I was just thinking maybe you have some reach out there in the accounting world where you have a list of folks that help do payroll at a reasonable price for a lake district. So that's a two-part thing. Part one is that I just noticed there's extra accounting demands for grants, and part two is payroll.
So I'll try and answer the first part, and Mike might be able to help out with the second part. On the first part, I believe with the DNR, this would probably be a case where the DNR has agreed to advance a portion of the funding that you need for the grant. So they're giving you money before the work is done. And their concern is just that it doesn't sort of get sloshed into a whole bunch of other funds and it's not clear where that money is. So I think they're saying if they advance you money, they want you to kind of have an earmarked account just for that advance money that's for the specific purpose that the money was advanced for. So an example here would be the kind of related to your second one. If they advanced you money to help pay for Clean Boat, Clean Waters staff, then you'd have that set up as the Clean Boat, Clean Waters grant, and then you'd be paying people out or paying invoices out of that to cover the payroll that you're talking about. Now, the question for me about payroll services or for-profit companies that do help out with this, yes, they exist. I only know that because I've been involved in different nonprofits that have used them. My challenge as a state employee is that I can't like point you to a specific one and say, hey, you should go to this place because they give you a good deal. Mike, as a nonprofit, can actually talk more freely about what the different service providers are that are out there. And I don't know, Mike, if you have, I thought you maybe had experience with some of the payroll service providers.
I don't have a ton of experience, but I can, for instance, at Wisconsin Lakes, we use just the Intuit payroll service through QuickBooks. We do our books through QuickBooks, and I've found that to be relatively reasonably priced, especially if you don't have a lot of employees. There are other ones, Paychex, is ADP a payroll service? All are, in my experience, I've been with several different nonprofits that have used different services. They're all pretty much the same, but the costs can vary pretty widely. So, and the other thing you want to look into is what level of aid do they provide in doing payroll tax reporting for you. So some services, it comes bundled in that they file your Form 941s and all that. Some, it's an extra charge. And so you just want to know what you're getting into and what you might have to end up doing yourself.
Okay, thank you.
And I think when it comes to like payroll processing, because you're such a small entity, most lake districts, it still might be worthwhile to talk to some folks in the nonprofit world who are also small entities that maybe only have 4 or 5 staff who are working part-time. So an example I would think of, just about anywhere in the state of Wisconsin, you're going to find a humane society, and they're usually small programs, and they're usually funded through a lot of agreements with county and local government. So they are kind of spending taxpayer dollar, but they have to solve the same riddle that you're talking about. And I find Humane Society people are usually really friendly and helpful. So they're the kind of folks I might go to, or a similar thing might exist in your folks who are providing emergency food services. If they're like a soup kitchen or a community pantry, sometimes they have a couple of people on staff. They're not usually full-time and they're usually not making a whole lot of money, but they have to figure out how do we do an accounting system for them. So those would be the just two. If you're looking for something local and you want to know what the local people are doing, that might be who I'd reach out to.
All right, thank you.
I think Ron is next
Sure.
with the question.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a question about budgeting. So I understand that we shouldn't be accumulating funds as a lake district. And we're in the situation where we're a new lake district. We're in our second year and we're running our lake association parallel, at least for one more year, because we had a DNR grant and we want to close that out in the lake association. And we did quite a bit of fundraising, and quite a bit for us is like $3,000 or $4,000 before the grant, because it was a reimburse after the fact and we didn't want to take a loan. So, you know, we're going to consider closing the lake association and donating the lake association funds to the lake district. But is that just going to now sort of force us to say, oh, we got this pot of money, so, and it wasn't directed at anything, so now we have to decrease our tax for this next year? Or can we stipulate, here's a donation coming into the lake district that we want to be separate as a stipulation and saved for, hopefully someday we're going to get an alum treatment approved for our lake. So what are our options for dealing with this situation?
I think from kind of a legal Chapter 33 and local government finance perspective, your answer, you're thinking that you would have to reduce the levy proportional to the grant received is kind of correct, unless if that grant was for the current year for an existing project to pay that off. If it was something where you're expected to hold on to it for a long time, you're going to have a difficult time doing that. And that sort of helps explain why there's such things as high school sport booster clubs. So remember before I said you can donate $1 million to the school to have a stadium built, but that doesn't happen very often. And so usually instead a small nonprofit forms called the Booster Club, and they raise that money and they hold on to it and they keep that money separate from the school district's budget. Another way that you can go about this that I would maybe recommend thinking about and looking into would be through an area community foundation. So across Wisconsin now we see more community foundations that are set up kind of for this purpose of managing money and holding on to accounts. They may charge a small amount to do it, but they're also part of a bigger effort to engage donors on bigger community projects. An example of that actually operates at the statewide scale is the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. So they're sort of like the separate nonprofit for the Wisconsin DNR. We all could make donations to the DNR if we wanted to, but mostly we would make those donations to the Natural Resources Foundation. And they can actually set up foundation accounts specific to your group. And this is also a way to just think about how you don't want to have the day-to-day operations of a lake association, but you may want to have the possibility that people who really love that lake and care so much about it that they perhaps put things in their will. They want to make sure that there's always a source of revenue to keep the water clean or to fight invasive species. Setting up one of those foundation accounts could help you out in the long run. Okay, so and just to be clear, the money that will end up in our lake association account was really fundraised. It wasn't, you know, it's not the result of the grant program. And right, I like the idea. I'm just concerned that we're so small right now. Our lake district officers are the same as our lake association officers, be the same as our area grant support, whatever the program is, officers. And I don't know that we're going to be able to legally, they'd all be different entities, but I don't know how you tease any of it apart. Right. So there are, Mike would know about this, but there are rules that when you wind down a nonprofit, that money can't be put into like for-profit enterprises, right? So you couldn't say, right, it has to go to another nonprofit. Yep, right. Exactly. but giving a nonprofit's money to a local unit of government or to a state government or the federal government, those are considered by the IRS to be legitimate reallocations of a nonprofit's balances when they wind down. And what I'm just recommending is maybe thinking about, or at least explore, the community foundation option before you fully commit. But if it's a really small amount, then as far as the Lake District budget goes, it really shouldn't impact their budget that much either.
Well, I mean, our Lake District budget is less than 5,000 a year. So, and we're only 1 year in. So if we transfer 3,000 or 4,000, then it's
Yeah.
right. But okay, thank you very much. Sorry for
You
the
bet.
time here.
We had a question in the chat from Patricia. She says it was mentioned that lake districts are very different from sewer districts in terms of budget, et cetera. Our district budgets for sewer, garbage collection, lake management, et cetera. So we have multiple responsibilities. What is a good resource for districts such as ours? Do you have any ideas, Eric?
I guess I'm a little confused. So your Lake District budgets for all these things, and if it's going well, then you can keep doing that. There are several Lake Districts that take on these additional projects. Generally, the big thing here would be to, you're probably then using special charges, right? To if say the garbage collection is only happening at properties with improvements, there's a house or a cabin, then people with unimproved parcels shouldn't be chipping in to pay for everybody else's garbage pickup. So that might be a little bit more complicated. What is a good resource? I don't know, Patricia, if you want to unmute yourself and clarify the question a little bit, I'd be happy to try to work this out.
She may not be on anymore, but Patricia, if you are, feel free to.
Yeah, we'll kind of get back to that, I guess.
Yeah.
I have everybody's email, and we'll send you out some follow-up to this meeting as well. So try and connect people that way. Tammy and Tom also commented about, could you go through a local or county municipality to do payroll instead of going with a private payroll service? Potentially, if you have a really good working relationship with them, they're also probably going to ask you a lot of questions about making sure that they're not responsible for these folks, that they really are employees of the Lake District, not of the town and not of the county. So they might have to clarify those things out. Whereas these payroll firms try to make it really clear up front, all they're doing is processing payroll for you. They take no responsibility as the supervisor or manager of these people, nor do they have like an implication around things like workers' comp insurance, things like that. See someone has their hand up.
Yeah, Corp Johnson iPad has been waiting patiently.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me say that this is terrific. I'm a new treasurer. A longtime district commissioner passed away unexpectedly, and there's virtually no documentation on how to do this work. So this has been really informative, and I don't want to take everyone's time for something that's specific to my district. Wondered, how do I get in touch with you to have a conversation around questions about things like a dam project that we thought we were going to pay for? The DNR stepped up, paid for more. We now have this balance of funds in our accounts that are unallocated. I would think that would impact the levy, our request for levy, but not sure how those are connected. So what's the best way to reach you, just to have a conversation that's specific to Lake Puckaway?
Yeah, I'd say shoot me an email. So I put my email in the chat.
Okay.
Give me some possible dates. The next week is actually kind of crazy for me, but things
Sure.
settle out. Hopefully you're not looking for like a 24-hour response.
No.
We're trying to be pretty responsive. If you shoot me an email, we'll try and schedule a time when we can call. We're also been very fortunate. Not only Mike Engelson from Wisconsin Lakes helping out, but he has a board member who went through a process of forming a lake district. So they're relatively new, and he was new to all this. His name is Dan Buckus, and Dan's been really helpful too. He's a person that I bounce ideas or questions off of. So we may get more people involved in the question, just trying to get you the best answer possible.
Okay, and finally, just one quick question, also new to me, the requirement to report the first 6 months of expenditures. Our annual meeting is scheduled for June early June of next month. So there would not be 6 months worth of records. What do you recommend? We could certainly say there'll be no expenditures in June and report it that way. Is that probably the best approach?
I'm gonna invoke the power of Judy and ask if Judy has an answer to this one. Because I'm not sure. I mean, it is required by statute, but I'm not sure, like, there isn't like someone from the Attorney General's office who's gonna swoop into your meeting
Sure.
and pull out your budget and say, you have 5 months and 7 months, not 6 and 6. And then
Okay.
torch everything.
Okay.
Yeah,
Judy?
I think I would agree with Eric on that. I think that the statutes used to say that you couldn't hold your annual meeting until 6 months had elapsed.
Okay. I don't think anyone
And-
recognized that.
So that would solve that part of the problem. But I
Yeah.
don't think that they're going to come down and punish you for it.
Okay.
Do the best you can to estimate the expenses and
Okay.
with as much detail and paper trail as possible.
And I think, again, what the statute is trying to represent is that when you have this annual meeting and you're talking about next year's budget, you're
Mhm.
partway through a current year's budget.
Sure.
So they're
Sure.
sort of like, it's a work in progress,
Yeah.
and you should be able to show about what you spent up to that point in your budget and what you think you're going to spend to close out the year. And so that's why we're talking about next year's budget. It's sort of reflecting what happened completely the year before,
Sure.
what's happened so far this year, what we think is going to happen.
Got it.
And
Okay.
that's a little different because a lot of your local government partners, school districts and county boards, they're usually really finalizing their budget process, usually October, November-ish.
Right.
So it's pretty
Right.
clear what the current year looked like because it's almost
Yeah.
done. And then they're talking about what's going to happen starting January 1.
Yeah,
Okay.
and most of our work is done in the summer, so it's really a lot of guesswork in our budgets because we don't get the bills for the work or we haven't done the work. So it's a big
Okay.
guesswork thing
Okay.
on the budget there anyway.
All right. It's very helpful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I don't see anything else in the chat. Anybody else have anything?
I just had an additional comment on the gentleman who was asking about the grant, having to keep a separate account for the grant. And I don't think you need to have a separate account as long as you keep a separate accounting, because they want to be able to see every check that you wrote for money for that grant. They don't want it lumped in with other bills that you paid that month. They want to be able to pull, so you have to make these reports to them. And it makes it easier for you if you keep a separate tally of all the expenses that you've spent on that grant.
And here's an example. I can email this again in the post meeting update, but this is from Dan Butkus, and this is their Squash Lake District up in Oneida County. And kind of what you see on here is that they do identify the Eurasian Water Milfoil Grant Fund, and they identify it as temporarily restricted. So they show, what was in it, and then what's going to be in it. They're showing that it's supposed to be sort of spent down, and the same thing for a planning grant. And I can ask him if he can kind of explain exactly how these numbers came about. But it's the idea that the grant money doesn't just sort of get sucked into some other account line. You have to show that you really do have that revenue sitting in an account.
And what you spent it for is what they really want to know.
Sure. Yeah. And usually that's in the grant reporting as well. You
Right.
can't just say like, we spent the money.
Yeah.
Thank you. They're going to want more information than that.
Other questions?
Yeah, Larry commented that's what he's done too, is keeping things just a little bit separate or keeping it identified as sort of a restricted fund within your overall budget.
I did put in the chat earlier, there had been some questions about where the DNR notice should get sent to for the annual meeting, and I pulled it out of people of the lakes. I'm assuming that that address hasn't changed. It looked right to me. So
Yeah.
I think in People of the Lakes, it says to send it to the Lakes Management section, which is now the Lakes and Rivers section, but it would get to the right person if you sent it to that address regardless.
Well, I didn't say this at the outset, and now there's 18 of you here, or 17 or 16, but thank you very much for all you do. You're generally volunteers who are doing this work, so I appreciate it on behalf of everybody who gets to enjoy the state's lake resources. This partnership is still going strong, and we anticipate it's going to go strong for decades into the future. So we do really appreciate your work as commissioners and treasurers to do this.
I would concur on that. This session is recorded and it'll be posted on the Extension Lakes webpage for the Thursday at 4 webinars, which I put the link in the chat.